Okay, alright. Hello and welcome back to the Make Lemonade podcast, a show brought to you by Lemon Squeezy as we hope to inspire you to make money from your own lemonade stand. I'm one of your co-hosts, James, and I'm back here with JR Farr, who is the co-founder and CEO of Lemon Squeezy. And we are joined by another CEO today, Guillermo Rauch, who is the CEO of Vercel, which are a cloud platform that has built some pioneering technology, including the Next.js framework for React. To give you a sense of the size of Vercel, they raised 150 million Series D back in 2021 at a $2.5 billion valuation. They are absolutely massive. And this is an exciting episode because this comes shortly after Guillermo has announced that we are working together, Lemon Squeezy and Vercel, to build the world's fastest checkout experience. So naturally, we had to get him onto the podcast to discuss how exactly we're going to achieve this together. We also talk about the inception of Next.js, if there are any downsides to open source, and we round off talking about Vercel and the business as a whole. Let's get into the episode. Guillermo, welcome to the pod. How are you doing?
Great, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I want to kick off talking about Lemon Squeezy and the upcoming partnership that you teased on Twitter the other day to much fanfare, shall we say. So tell me about how you connected with Lemon Squeezy, with JR, and how this sort of came about.
Yeah, I have an anecdote that I don't know if JR would relate to, but it does feel like Lemon Squeezy is this, from the outside, an overnight success. I'm sure a lot of years and sweat and tears in the making, and I'm sure it's always like that for a lot of entrepreneurs. But I started noticing it all over social media. At Vercel, we help a lot of folks go from zero to a global application in seconds. So naturally, that attracts a lot of makers, a lot of folks that are creating software products, innovative software products, especially in the AI space. So I kind of started noticing that everyone was sharing their products and selling them through the Lemon Squeezy platform. And that was just me, like, doom scrolling on X, right? Like just noticing people talking about it. And at some point, someone said, I'm working on an SDK for Lemon Squeezy. And I was like, that's interesting. I have a lot of experience building SDKs and developer tools for the JavaScript and TypeScript ecosystem. And it sounds like if this works really well on Vercel, it's going to be awesome because a lot of folks are going to build apps that monetize through Lemon Squeezy. So I reached out. The thread, I think, kind of died there at that time. And then I think fast forward maybe like 6 months or a year later, funny story, I was in Tokyo. JR, I don't know if I shared this story when we first chatted. And I bought two things. I was with my son, we're on vacation, and I was like, okay, we're having breakfast. And I was like, what can I do right now? I'm going to buy some software, of course. And I bought two apps, one for compressing videos, because I really struggle with like the size of videos that I share. And then I can't remember what the other one was. And both these apps just happen to be sold on and monetized through Lemon Squeezy. Oh, and the other one's the Screen.studio, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, everything is Lemon Squeezy. I think I might have even made a meme, which I always do. And I was like, okay, from Tokyo, and the reason I love traveling, this is like the nerdiest reason you could imagine. It's not just because I like seeing new towns, cities, places to visit, etc. I also love testing what the internet feels like. It's the weirdest thing to say, but I'm the Vercel CEO. I love testing what the internet feels like from everywhere in the world.
That's cool.
And I collect a lot of anecdotes about this. So I'm from Argentina. Even the simplest websites in Argentina just take forever to load. They're not well, globally distributed and things like that. But Argentina side, I go to Tokyo and I notice the same. So like a lot of sites could be a lot faster from Tokyo. And by the way, if you fly to New York, it's fascinating. If you really pay attention, you'll notice that the internet, it's at its peak. It's the fastest you'll ever experience. Why? Because the vast majority of servers in the cloud are actually in Northern Virginia. So the latency from New York is like 5 milliseconds. So it feels like traveling to New York and of course traveling to Virginia, Ashburn, but I don't think that many people go there. It feels like you're traveling to the heart of the cloud. So here it was in Tokyo. I was like, this could be a lot faster. This checkout experience could be a lot faster. It worked really well. And guess what? We're developing technology that helps with that kind of experience. So the Next.js app router, which has the ability to stream content, plus our global edge network is the perfect infrastructure to build these globally fast products. And what I also love about this kind of product is that, there's users all over the world that have completely different levels of access to internet quality, device power, and so on and so forth. So it's an awesome challenge to use the power of the cloud to make the experience universally fast and personalized for everyone. The other thing about checkouts that really intrigues me as a nerd is that they're actually highly personalized. So the classic sort of myth in software engineering over the last couple of years is that, well, slap a CDN onto your product is going to be fast. But that usually comes at the expense of making your website static. So for a checkout, it means that it doesn't remember who you are. It doesn't remember your favorite payment method. It doesn't adapt the payment method to the device that you're on. Like, I love buying stuff with Apple Pay on my mobile device,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. So it kind of was like, okay, these two worlds can come together and will benefit the entire ecosystem of software builders and beyond. So that's a little bit of the long story of how we got connected.
So who reached out to who?
It was G. He pinged, and it was like, it was amazing. It was like, hey, what if we help you build the world's fastest checkout? Like, that's it. And so as soon as he said that, it stuck in my head for a long time, and I was like, we have to do this. And yeah, so we started meeting, and I think it's for me, G, I listened to one of the podcasts that you were on. You talk about speed from a conversion standpoint. And personally, for me, there's two reasons why I'm excited about this. One is that it benefits everyone, the customer experience and also all the merchants selling, right? Conversions.
Totally.
The stat that you said, G, and tell me if I'm wrong, you said for every 100 milliseconds of speed that you gain, you pick up 8% better conversion rate on mobile.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct. That's a Deloitte study that Google commissioned, because there's always all these numbers that get thrown around, and like the reality is that they need to get updated and revisited over time. So Amazon used to throw away the number that 100 milliseconds of slowdown meant 1% fewer sales. But when Google revisited the study and commissioned Deloitte to perform it, especially for e-commerce across travel, fashion, luxury, etc., they noticed that the effect was far more pronounced in mobile. So 100 milliseconds on mobile could result in up to 8% conversion lifts. And overall, like they tested and validated every variation of the number. And the reality is that you make shit faster and you sell more stuff. So it's
Right.
really, we're going to put that to the test again. So I'm excited.
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll do that. And with G's help and his team's help, we'll do a lot of benchmarking, baseline
Yes.
stuff where we're at, see where we get to, which we can kind of talk through if we need to. And then the other reason why I'm excited about it is we need to make sure from our perspective that we have diversity and I guess redundancy where I'm almost able now with Vercel and Next.js to decouple our experience from anything else. And so there's a lot of features we gain, like feature flags. And so as we're rolling A/B testing, like there's so much stuff we can do with confidence. And so that I think, and then also too, behind the scenes, however we move the checkout, whoever's processing it, whatever, it's all decoupled, right? And so it doesn't really matter where I go next with it. So that's exciting.
When I talk to CEOs, and recently had a great conversation with the chief digital officer of Chico's, which is a large retail store that serves all their workloads through Vercel, they were saying this is the last sort of big digital transformation we do because we're turning the business into a modular business. So you say the front end is over here, and your search engine is over here, and your CMS is over here, and your personalization engine is over here, and so on and so forth. So at any given point, you can say, I'm unhappy with this vendor, and I can just replace the module. And this is kind of an insight that goes back to, I love Jeff Bezos and a lot of the things that he did in building the formidable Amazon business. But one of the most brilliant things he did is that at Amazon, he noticed that there was a lot of bottleneck in engineers and product people and designers collaborating together. And the collaboration medium was conversation, was tickets, was getting together in a room and putting a requirement forward and like begging another person to fulfill it. And what he noticed is that the trajectory of the business changed, and the scalability of Amazon, as he calls it, an invention machine, changed when he said teams will collaborate with API boundaries instead of collaborating with, sort of handshake agreements and meetings.
Yeah.
And when you think about composable architecture, which is what we were just talking about, is applying that to our own businesses. We collaborate over the network. In fact, when we collaborate with Vercel in Lemon Squeezy, we're going to collaborate over the network at the end of the day because Vercel is a front-end service. It renders your checkout page, it renders your storefronts, and so on and so forth. And yeah, we can all meet and we're going to be talking on Slack and whatnot. But at the end of the day, like, it's just so much more agile that here's my API, here's your API, here's my API, here's your API. It just makes us better at doing business together.
Well, I, for one, am excited to see where this goes and building the world's fastest checkout. It's going to be mind-blowing seeing the power of both of your companies coming together to create something really cool. I want to talk a little bit more about your background, G, and some of the stuff you've done in the past when it relates to open source. JR, you've also been in the open source world. Tee up, G, on some of the background stuff that you've been interested in.
Well, okay, so this is the connection I want to make, G. So mine was in the WordPress world, and we ended up getting acquired, and we would work close with Automatic, and we'd see Matt and the teams, and I always found it fascinating the way that he monetized WordPress over the years. Right, it's open source software, and then they're the best at hosting it with WordPress.com. I know that in your background, CloudUp was one of my favorite apps back in the day that you built. I had no idea until this interview that you made that, and when they were bought, and I stopped using it after you guys had sold a few years later, just because it felt like it started, to go down because you obviously weren't there. But I guess what I'm trying to tee up is when I look at Vercel and Next.js, it feels very similar to WordPress.org and WordPress and Automatic, or even like what Supabase is doing right now with their stuff. So did you draw inspiration from watching being at Automatic? You get acquired, you watch what WordPress.org is doing with Automatic, or vice versa. Is that where that came from? Did that ideate that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were two major inspirations that I got from Automatic. Number one is that you can create a massive community through open source. I remember Matt talking about the WordPress meetups globally and visiting them and engaging with developers in the field. And I was super inspired by that because I was already kind of doing the tour of giving conference talks and talking about JavaScript and so on. And I think what Matt had done really well is that he was able to create this massive community and also create a very successful business without jeopardizing one another. So WordPress continues to thrive and continues to grow, and WordPress.com as a business is doing also tremendously well. Yeah. So that was kind of like the big inspiration. What I realized later on is that my journey was going to be different. I focus a lot more on sort of infrastructure, whereas I think what WordPress ended up going towards is more creating more like in the Squarespace side of things, creating more of a site building experience. You can think of it this way, like they're more of a consumer business. We're more of an enterprise business right now.
Yes.
So we end up helping folks in many cases that are going through the graduation of maybe I got started online with some of those point and click tools, but now I'm doing serious business. Now I need to employ engineers. Now I need to become a product engineering organization. And that's the transition that I got really inspired to help companies do because I live in San Francisco and we take it for granted that the average product making ability here is just like incredible. Like we all kind of know the best practices like CI/CD, and now we're using LLMs, and we update our vocabulary so fast. I remember when I first heard about foundation models, and then I started hearing everybody talk about foundation models. And this is like even like a year or more before ChatGPT. So you kind of get a taste always here of the future. And I was like, okay, how could we create a platform that made that future completely democratized and accessible to everybody? Very much like Matt wanted to democratize blogging on the internet. So for us, it was like democratizing the cloud, democratizing the ability to create incredible products. And that's why I mentioned that the way we even engage when we partner with companies is very much, here's the infrastructure, here's the APIs, here's all the manuals, here's the help. We call it serverless, but it's very much a machine that everybody in the world has access to. And that goes back to like why I enjoy traveling, because I think about empowering every developer on the planet. So Matt and WordPress were a huge part of creating that inspiration.
When Next.js came up, was that years of tinkering and being in that ecosystem, that space, or was it, I have this idea, I'm going to call it, it came to life? Or how did you come up with the idea of Next.js?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story of first being humbled and then utilizing that power not as a force of good.
Okay.
Because, and I mentioned being humbled because I created a lot of successful open source software before. One of them was Socket.io.
Yep.
I mentioned recently as a little bit of an anniversary post that it's become so prolific and so viral that it's powered underwater exploration vehicles. It recently went viral because someone started deconstructing some little like temperature adjustment panel in their apartment. And
Wow.
it found that it was running Node.js and Socket.io, and it kind of went viral because it went viral because the guy was like, "Oh my god, this is so over-engineered. It's just a simple thing for my apartment." Like, it was hilarious. So I took it. It's like I took it as a win. I think it's a win. But when I saw React, I saw something that generalized over and solved a lot of the problems that I wanted to solve in a completely different way. Because ultimately, what I wanted to do was create snappy, real-time applications. That was kind of like my obsession. And the moment of being humbled is that you can accomplish, when you realize that like you're pursuing a certain path, in that you think you can just keep digging and digging and digging and digging and digging to get to the answer. But in reality, like it's just like the path is even just being like 15 degrees off is enough to get off trail over time.
Right.
And I think this happened to a lot of entrepreneurs when they realize that like you could be grinding for 10 years and it's just not going to work. Like you have to pivot, you have to change, you have to adapt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that happened to me. It's like, okay, holy shit, this React thing that Meta has put out is what I've always wanted to create. That was kind of my internal feeling. And what I started to do was, in order to very well understand it, I love this quote about, in order to really understand something, you have to be able to reinvent it. And so I wrote a clone of React very early on. And this was probably like, I don't know, like maybe a year or two after React came out. And I realized it was going to be futile. And I realized that, and this is why I never got too excited by a lot of the React competitors, because I realized that there's a lot that you can sort of improve on the surface of it. Like, oh, I can make this 10% slimmer. At the time, in fact, my copy of React was like way smaller. And I realized that this thing is taking off and it was creating an ecosystem with it. It was so groundbreaking of a departure from what everybody else was doing that I thought it didn't matter even if you made it 1% better, 10% better, etc. It's just inevitable. It has like escape velocity. But the opportunity came later when I realized, okay, all of the experts love this React technology. And once again, it's kind of like that calling of my career. But no one can actually create a site with it. Like just I wanted to create a simple page for my startup with this groundbreaking, awesome discovery technology, the second coming of like the atomic model. And yet, like, okay, like I'm sitting down, I want to create a page with it. And that's when the idea for Next.js is born. It's all about accessibility. It's all about getting the innovation into the hands of more people. And one of the things that we really did that now looking back, we were just so right, is we put React in a different location, so to speak. We put it in the server first. And that was a departure. And I remember the moment I was in my apartment. I was still working from my apartment here in San Francisco. And I remember when Meta puts out their own framework for React, Create React App. And first, this sinking feeling of like, holy shit, my idea is just useless at this point. Like, holy crap. And then like it's like we're so back, it's so over in like a very rapid like cycle. And then 20 minutes later, they're doubling down on client-side rendering. And it was so interesting because it's like detecting an asymmetry in the market, because I realized, wait a second, how can you put it in the client first? If I know, because even when I was a kid, I loved reverse engineering sites. I know that the best websites in the universe, the things that have really taken over the world, are server rendered first. Amazon.com, server rendered first. Google.com, server side rendering with streaming. You name it. Like the things that have actually scaled have taken that path. So I didn't have to be like the second coming of Albert Einstein to say, like maybe there is an opportunity here. So with my background in Node.js, I started like creating this framework that not only was easy to use, but it set you up for success with the right defaults from the get-go. And it turned out
Interesting.
to be right, and now everybody's pivoting back to that approach,
Yeah.
including a lot of the other frameworks. Obviously, we're continuing to invest and sort of disrupt ourselves to do even more on the server and do it in slightly different ways. But the bet that we put even like 8 years ago turned out to be quite spot on.
I guess on the other side of open source, do you see any disadvantages of the open source model that you are currently experiencing, or is it all positive?
I think it's all positive. I think one thing I would say is that not every open source project, of course, will lead to a really, really, really large venture style business opportunity, but open
Right.
source is just universally useful, right? It's not meant or necessarily designed for that. So there has been situations where people say, "Oh yeah, I tried the open source thing; it didn't work for us." I think it really depends on each scenario. There's no world in which Next.js could be proprietary because folks want optionality, right? One of the things that also was coming out at the same time about React was Kubernetes. And one of the things that made Kubernetes really successful was now the world of DevOps had an opportunity to say there's a standard and it's portable. So every company was just like, once again, even maybe you could have conceived something that was like 20% fast or whatever. Everybody was like, okay, standardizing on this. And the same is true for the world of front end, right? We need folks to have tools and standards that are universal. I used to joke the awesome thing about Next.js being open source is that I would tell CEOs, CTOs, is that your engineers will be able to go to Stack Overflow to solve their problems. And now I joke they'll be able to ask ChatGPT. And ChatGPT knows more about open source dev tools, of course, because it's trained on that data. It's trained on
Mm.
all the, appropriately licensed public Git repo data. It's trained on all the documentation. We continue to feed it more data. So how do you compete with a proprietary framework? That's
Yeah.
especially the ones that are living inside corporations. So
Yeah.
I talked to the CTO and head of infra at a massive e-commerce company the other day, and they were telling me about their internal React framework. And they were kind of talking about this issue of like, okay, every time we recruit a new engineer, they have to get up to speed with the XXX way of building things. Whereas one of the first times that I realized that Next.js was something really special was I started noticing that companies were acquiring other companies. And because both companies were using Next.js, the integration velocity of those products was just off the charts.
Right.
So that was kind of my initial like dream was React will change the internet by modularizing it, turning into components. I used to use this analogy of the ribosome and how the best invention of evolution and biology is that everything is just sort of made of the same fundamental building blocks. And they almost have like a geometry that allows them to couple with each other and extend themselves. And that's the same thing that React kind of brought to the table. That's why it's so sticky, even though people troll it on X, right? People
Mm.
will say, oh yeah, use effect fires twice in development mode. And like, but you have to step out and you have to realize sort of the economic advantages that it's brought to the table. And the
Right.
de-opting of that has a cost. It's
Yeah.
totally fine for you to say, look, I discovered a new way of doing components. It uses WebAssembly. I'm shipping a bytecode interpreter to the browser. I'm rendering on WebGL. I'm running a browser inside a browser inside a browser, and it's better because it does 120 FPS, and React can only get to 110 FPS. And that's totally fine, and I would never discredit an innovation along those lines. And by the way, I'm not name calling anybody, I just made something up. but you have to understand what is the thing that you're trading off in terms of that ecosystem power.
So now that we've kind of talked about all the open source stuff, I guess jumping into Vercel as the business of Vercel. So from what I can see, you start that company in 2015, which is 8 years ago. Almost 9. But then you don't, when I look on like Crunchbase, you don't really raise any money. Did you go straight to a Series A? Did you ever do any seed rounds, or did you just build for 5 years and then raise a Series A?
Yeah, I think going back in time, I did something pretty unusual, I think, by entrepreneurship standards. So I raised from my previous co-founder who went on to become a partner at CRV. I
Okay.
raised right away. He knew that there was something special in building open source companies. Actually, he was a huge believer in open source and dev tools before it was cool. Now
Yep.
you get a lot of GitHub stars and like someone like emails you a term sheet, or at least during the zero interest rate times. But obviously there's a lot more investor interest now in that sort of methodology today as compared to back then. And what I wanted to do was build this open source project together with the infrastructure. So I had two basic ideas, right? Like you can't just build stuff in localhost 3000. What I mean by that, if folks are not super familiar with the development process, is when developers sit down to work, they work on the local devices, and that's when the magic happens, really. Now, when they need to collaborate with somebody else, it's where the infamous meme, "it worked on my machine," comes
Yeah.
into fruition, right? Well, yeah, like the thing that you're working on is only in one computer, the developer's computer. And if the designer, if the marketer, if the CEO, whoever wants to take a look, suggest something, give feedback, like they have to wait until like, I don't know, 3 weeks later, it finds its way into staging. And that really bothered me because I was noticing how everything was moving towards the cloud, right? Like design with Figma and even GitHub, right? Like GitHub is basically cloudifying your local Git repo. And I had this idea of doing that for deployments. And so I started on that idea. And then simultaneously, I had that problem that I mentioned earlier, which is I wanted to create a simple page with this cutting edge technology for building websites and applications, which was React. And at the time, I didn't know that these two things were going to converge into a very powerful combination. But the requirements were all self-evident. Like I wanted to build stuff really fast, and I wanted to exit my computer really fast because I'm building a startup. I need to get feedback from people. I need to deploy instantaneously. I need to share it with folks. In fact, one of the things that we did early on that kind of emerged organically was we first set up all of the initial infrastructure here in the West Coast, which is a pretty unusual thing to do by cloud standards. As I mentioned, it all lives in Virginia. But I wanted things to just be alien type fast so that my colleagues here would deploy and be like, this is 100 times faster than deploying to any other thing they've ever used. Kubernetes, oh yeah, that's like primitive tech. Or servers and SSHing and deploying, writing scripts and whatever, again, primitive tech. So what I realized later on was, and it's funny because when I tell this story, it almost sounds like it's the opposite of what you would think, right? Like you would think, oh, I created an open source project and then I thought about starting a business around it. I actually was kind of evolving these two things simultaneously, trying to create awesome things and ship them fast.
Do you think the rise of Vercel, like if you look back, was there moments that are pivotal? Was it a feature? Was it a client? Was it what were some of the moments that kind of got you to kind of where you are now?
There are a bunch. One of the things that was quite pivotal is that when we were building Vercel, something that was quite frustrating for me was I was obsessed with this idea of dynamic rendering. Dynamic. Again, I'm in the head of that kid in Argentina that had figured out how Google worked by just viewing source and curling and seeing how it responds. And I'm out here in Silicon Valley and static starts taking off. And I'm going to address this because I know that a question came up from the audience, like Jamstack, et cetera, and like overcoming that challenge and whatever. And it was very frustrating to me because I started seeing a lot of venture capitalists like putting a lot of money behind static solutions. And I was like, okay, like we're here to like invent the future. We're here to create and democratize the things that have worked for the giants of the web. And by the way, I'm not saying that just because from a mission, because it sounds good and whatever. I'm saying it because it's been a tried and true methodology in Silicon Valley. PagerDuty, awesome company, we used it, etc. It was the co-founder of that company was at Amazon, and at Amazon they had invented an internal pager system for dealing with incidents. So he leaves and he creates a company, and then lots of people benefit. So it's a tried and true technique. So I was thinking like no one ships a static sites. No at scale e-commerce business has ever succeeded with a static website. But here's where I actually give a lot of credit to that micro era of the internet's history now, which is that parts of the things that make a static website good, you want to retain. So a pivotal moment in Vercel was when we invented this technology, ISR, that combines the best of both worlds. You can make some parts static, which make them globally fast all over the planet. It gives you predictability about how quickly it renders. It saves you on compute costs. It saves you on database costs. So all of those things, and I can now see why a lot of people got into that solution. Because like, look at that, like, let's write them down. Like, even getting more nerdy, like O1, constant time to first byte. Like
Right.
a lot of those things were useful. So in the beginning is like the stages of grief. I rejected it. Later on, I started to appreciate it a bit more. I was like, like, and then I also did, like my brain grew as like the like galaxy brain guy. It's like, wait a second. A lot of people start static. It's like if you go to rauchg.com, it's my personal website. It is static. And some parts are more dynamic. So it's like the beauty of Vercel is that we can let you pick and choose and whatever. But what about giving people the journey? Instead of saying, you know what, like, you're all wrong. We're out here in our glass house of perfection and we're building like Amazon, but we're a 5-person startup. We kind of brought the best of two worlds together. And we told this story to people too. Look, you're static today or you're embarking on that journey. The technology will be ready for you when you want to move a step further. And that's why I started seeing a lot of the migrations from that world to Vercel. Because we didn't outright reject it. We said, oh, it's another stepping stone into your digital transformation future. So start that way, and we're here for you. So the long story short is the customer is always right. And there was an inkling of true in that demand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got it.
So, we're running towards end of time. JR put some questions out on Twitter, and we've got a couple of spicy questions for you. One of which is about Netlify and how you beat Netlify, and also this small but growing anti-Next.js sentiment. We've talked about how awesome it is and how great it works with Vercel, but like, what do you feel about this anti-Next.js sentiment?
Yeah, I kind of touched on the other one with regards to like the static versus like dynamic DNA. I think that determined a lot of that particular competition. And they've come around and they've done awesome things there too in the dynamic world and in their spheres of the same future that we want to see, which is we all want the web to win. We don't want walled gardens. We want open source solutions to thrive, etc. On Next.js, so I think it's a great question because I told the story of how the framework that Meta put out, and people use different terms like React is a meta framework, or I actually get lost. React is a framework, Next is a meta framework. But let's call it the solution that Meta put out that put React on the client. I'm not going to say it was wrong because React on the client has a ton of uses and utility, but you could argue it's the wrong default and starting point for a lot of applications. It's much better to start server first so that you can do things that are close to the data, even at build time, and then you can say, okay, I want some things to be client interactive. And that is best for the web at large because putting a lot of pressure on the device that could be so far away from the server that it's talking to is typically a huge source of slowness in applications. What's happening today is that React themselves, quote unquote, changed their mind. So React is now sort of adopting this server first mentality and incorporating a lot of the features that in the past Next was adding around it. So in a way, it's almost like Next is inspiring to some extent. And of course, there's been a lot of other data points in the world, but we did inspire some of the directions that the technology had to go into. And this is, by the way, not just because we inspired by writing documentation or talking about it on Twitter. It's also what the market has chosen, right? The largest websites in the world now run on Next.js, from ChatGPT to Nike.com. So you could argue that that's the way that a lot of folks, especially at larger scale, want to use React. So what folks are finding out now is that the React of today and the React that they learned over the past 8 years is changing quite dramatically. So some of the reactions that you're seeing is the natural reactions to change. Very much like I had a knee-jerk reaction when React came out. I was like, what? Like I told us sort of kind of how it broke my brain. But part of it is also that it's the early innings. And there's a lot of work to do still on improving the developer experience. We're well aware that we have to improve some of the error messages, like hydration failed, which folks love to point out on Twitter. And like someone was like, oh, are you looking at this in your Vision Pro headset? So I take all the feedback with love, and feedback truly is the gift of what makes Vercel better every day. And we'll continue to improve Next.js with a strong sense of conviction that this is the right direction for the internet and React and Next.js at large.
So I guess, like, kind of wrapping up here, you got massive amounts of funding, which I'm sure is a huge amount of pressure for you. I mean, what are you most excited about in the coming years, or where do you see Vercel going? What gets your gears going right now?
Yeah, folks point out that it sounds like a lot, but I think if you look at it in the larger scheme of things, of Vercel having the ambition to rethink the internet at large and power the best products on the internet come out in years to come, I think it's appropriate, and I think it's more so a huge empowerment for us, right? I mentioned earlier, if you believe that you're on the wrong path, things can get really tricky for you. You spin your wheels, you're fighting gravity, right? But if you get the reassurance from customers that are succeeding on the platform, the biggest gift that I get these days is that I don't know, I go to my favorite website, and without anybody telling me, it's like, oh, I found out this was built on Vercel. I went to an awesome an online storefront. It's like, oh, why is this fast? Oh, it's fast because it's on Vercel. As I continue to get that reassurance from the market, and by the way, it's grounded on the reality of using these products. Because I think the other thing that can mislead sometimes, especially if it happened in the capital-rich times of tech that were now a little bit behind us, is that your only fitness function is revenue and funding and things like that. But what is your grounding in, like, what is your contribution to the world? So our contribution to the world is that we're making a better internet. So we're very focused on continuing on that path, and we're taking small steps towards it.
Well, G, thank you so much for coming on and answering our questions and being on the Make Lemonade podcast. I am dead excited to see what happens with this collaboration with Vercel and Lemon Squeezy, and just making that checkout faster and faster and faster. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Okay, all right.